Well, hello everyone. I think we'll go ahead and get started for the sake of everybody's time. Thank you for joining us and thank you for your patience with our last minute reschedule. We are glad to welcome you all today. We will be talking about a very important topic, and that is President Truman and his presidential library. I wanted to go over just a few housekeeping rules before we get started. The first request is to please remain muted at all times during this conversation. We will have time for a Q&A at the end of the program. As you have your questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to drop them in the chat box and we'll get through them as soon as the presentation is complete. For your best viewing pleasure, go ahead and put your Zoom into speaker view so you can see the full presentation on your screen, and then we can go back after that for the Q&A. Lastly, we just invite you to sit back and grab a cup of coffee and enjoy. I wanted to let you know who we are hearing from today and why we're discussing this important topic. As we learn more about the 33rd U.S. President and the remarkable presidential library that now stands in his honor in the great state of Missouri. It is worth noting that we are just 12 days shy of the 80th anniversary of when President Truman took the oath of office following the unexpected death of Franklin D. Roosevelt. President Truman's time in the White House was instrumental in the decision for the Japanese surrender to take place aboard the USS Missouri, sealing our place in history for generations to come. With that, I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Mark Adams. Mark is the director of the Harry S. Truman Library and Museum, bringing over 30 years of experience in museum education and curation. His tenure with the Truman Library spans 27 years, during which he transformed visitor experiences and educational programming. Previously, he served as the education director at the Truman Library Institute before joining the library in 2014, where he later became the supervisory museum curator. He led the creation of the Truman White House Decision Center and the library's flagship education program. Mark has also worked with the Kansas State Historical Society and taught history in England and the University of Missouri. He holds degrees in history and geography from the University of Wolverhampton and is a postgraduate degree in education from the University of Liverpool. So with that, I'd like to invite Mark to go ahead and share his screen as he walks us through today's presentation.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation. I am Mark Adams, the director of the Harry S. Truman Library Museum in Independence, Missouri, Harry Truman's hometown, that he helped build this library back in 1957. So what I'm going to talk to you today is about how massive museum renovation we did in the last 3 years ago, $29 million renovation. And as I show you the exhibits, give an opportunity to tell you some of the stories and details about Harry Truman's life and presidency as we go through. I just wanted to share this opening photograph. This is kind of a monumental day for us back in the summer of 2021. And at the podium there, he's a little bit in the distance for the photograph, but at the podium there is Clifton Truman Daniel, Harry Truman's oldest grandson and the oldest living Truman relative, who is now in Chicago, but he came and visited us when we reopened our museum after a 4.5-year renovation project. And you're going to see some of the images today with showing you that new exhibit. But Clifton helped kick us off in 2021. And you see this new statue of Harry Truman welcoming everybody outside of our new entrance to the building back in that summer. Just to show you some of the people that were involved in this, often people will ask who the architects were and the designers and all of the different contractors we work with. So I wanted to make sure I get that out up front. But exhibit design was done by Gallagher and Associates. They have offices around the country, but we used primarily the Portland and San Francisco offices. We used Clark Anderson Architects, or a local Kansas City architectural firm. Monadnock Multimedia that are in Connecticut. 1220 Exhibit Fabrication in Nashville. And then our content team, we had a lot of staff involved, but primarily the staff people listed on there were kind of the key people that worked on the content and then worked with the designers as we went through the whole project. And so, yeah, there's the title of our presentation today, and is the title of our new exhibit that we're going to be talking about, Harry S. Truman, An Ordinary Man, His Extraordinary Journey. And we really like this title that we came up with, really to talk about his humble upbringing and his humble background, but the extraordinary things that he was able to accomplish throughout his presidency. As Jacqueline mentioned, from April 12th, 1945 through January 20th of 1953. So those are some of the things that I'm going to be showing you today, and I'm certainly welcome to answer questions at the end of the presentation. So some of the things we thought about before we went into this huge project. On the left, you kind of see some of the things we thought about in terms of content, and on the right, things about the types of exhibits we wanted and the technology and things like that. So we wanted to highlight Truman's accomplishments. We wanted to say more about the First Lady and their only daughter, Margaret Truman, and looking at the existing exhibits we had prior to 2021, things that had been either dealt with lightly or not dealt with in much detail or overlooked completely. Things like civil rights, the fur deal, the Red Scare, steel crisis, things like that. And I'll show you some images of how we treat those now in our new exhibits. We wanted to make sure we acknowledge mistakes and failures and missteps and not just make the exhibit kind of a glorified treatment of Harry Truman, but to really look at ups and downs, successes and failures, because we know that no president is perfect and certainly no human being is perfect. So we wanted to make sure we acknowledge that. We do a lot of that through the next bullet, which is to provide multiple perspectives on different issues, because as you're very, very well aware, I'm sure, Harry Truman did face a number of controversial issues as president. And so we wanted to make sure that we had different viewpoints featured within our exhibits. Our previous permanent exhibits had been redone about 2000, 2001. And in the last 20 years or more, there's been a lot of new scholarship, new research, and we wanted to make sure we included that. And then, of course, we wanted to make sure that it was relevant to today's audiences. A lot of that we did through technology and comparison, quotes and things like that within our exhibits. And that leads us to the right side to make sure we use the latest technology available to us, opportunities for feedback through stations throughout the museum, more interactive exhibits, lots more multimedia, include new collection items from the museum and archives collection. People may not realize we're both an archives and a museum. And so we have about 60 million documents in our archival collection and about 33,000 museum objects in our museum collection and about 100,000 still images as well. So we wanted to make sure we tapped in to all of that material. We actually changed the visitor entrance to make it easier to flow through the museum. And for the first time, even though the library opened in 1957, the museum opened in 57, it's the first time we actually had one exhibit that covered Truman's entire life from childhood through the presidency to death. So it seems extraordinary it would take until 2021 to do that, but that's the nature of the business. So that's what we tried to do, and we're very, very proud of what we were able to accomplish. So that's kind of the setup for what you're going to see. And there's the repeat of that image just to kind of kick us off. You can see a little bit closer Harry Truman waving his hat and Clifton Daniel there at the podium and the Navy band behind him as well. And so one of the things we mentioned there at the beginning is that we wanted to make sure we had the latest technology, the latest multimedia experience for the visitors. So we start out with our new introductory video theater, and we're with a 3-minute video. It's pretty short, that kind of takes you through what you see on the screen there from Truman being nominated as vice president in the summer of 1944, all the way through to that April 12th date that we've already mentioned in 1945 when he becomes president. So kind of about 10 months in Truman's life in about 3 minutes. So it's a pretty fast-paced video. And if you think of the things that are going on in late 1944 and early 1945, it kind of goes through the election in 44 when FDR is re-elected for his 4th term. Truman, of course, is his vice presidential candidate, the inauguration in January, and of course, what's happening in World War II in late 1944 and early 1945. And it screeches to a halt at the end of the video when Truman becomes president on April 12th. And then there's posed a question for all the visitors to say, what in Truman's past informs him to become a president. And then we explore all of our exhibits in the galleries to see how his past has prepared him for the presidency. So that's kind of the setup for the entire museum. So the first part of the exhibit is to learn about Truman's early life. And I've got a couple of photographs here, but some of the things you'll see there on the bullets that it focuses on are his early education, his time as a farmer, hobbies and interests like piano playing, some of the first jobs he has, like working in banks in Kansas City, his relationship with his family, and also his beginnings of a relationship with Bess Wallace, who's eventually, of course, going to become First Lady. And then that question that I posed, what in Truman's past prepared him for the presidency? So we're looking at the past at this point to see how it prepared him for later in life. And I've got another close-up. The central piece there in that exhibit is this letter tower. Now, I will say these letters that we have on display, they're all letters that Harry Truman wrote to Bess Wallace before they got married. We have about 1,320 of these letters in our archives from Harry Truman to Bess Wallace. You will not be surprised to hear these are reproductions that we have on display. We couldn't treat the originals that way, but we made digital reproductions of these and then displayed them in what we call this letter tower. So you can see these letters. Truman, 90% of the time, hand wrote his letters. So sometimes they can be tricky to read. But incidentally, all of these are all online on our website, and they all come with transcriptions. So you can maybe not have to decipher the handwriting. But this is the centerpiece of Truman's early life because his relationship with Bess Wallace is really key to his background, to the information we know about him is often in these letters. He's working as a farmer when they start dating, and he writes about that. And of course, he writes to Bess we've got letters from 1910 through 1957, so 47 years of letters. Of course, after 1957, he's in retirement and they're living together in Independence, Missouri. He actually retires in 1953, but continues the habit of letter writing. There are also interactives in here in this area, flip books where you can see close-ups of some of these letters. And it really highlights the rich content that we have in the archives. And it really gets to hear the story of his early life through his own words. So he's complaining about farming, or he's writing to Bess about oil speculation and trying to make it rich and all of these often failed ventures in his life. I mentioned that we have a lot of interactives in this same room. We have this whole wall that's called Lasting Impressions. It's a little faded out in the top left corner of that photograph, but that's what it says. And these are things that happened early on in Truman's life that left a lasting impression on him. And so there's all kinds of interactives, piano keys. There's a crank at the bottom to signify his first car. There's a Bible in there. There's quotes about his teachers and all of these things that impressed him early in life that informed him. And we have whole interactive wall that visitors of any age can explore. And so you can see this student looking through a magnifying glass to see some of our smaller artifacts that we have on display. And the student behind her who's a little faded out, he's turning a crank to basically start Harry Truman's first car, which was a 1911 Stafford motor car that he purchased used in 1914 to help him get from the farm in Grandview, Missouri, to come visit Bess in Independence, Missouri. They'd actually gone to high school together, graduated together in 1901, but they didn't really start dating until about 1910. And by then, Harry Truman is working on the family farm. So he needed a way to get to see her on the weekends. And so he purchased a car to do that, went out on picnics and things like that. We have lots of photographs and letters that help tell that story. So kind of the first monumental change in Harry Truman's life is in 1917, when Woodrow Wilson enters the United States into the First World War. Harry Truman's actually too old for the draft, but he volunteers and he's actually been in the National Guard earlier in life in about 1905 till about 1910. And in 1917, he rejoins the National Guard, volunteers for World War I, does training in Oklahoma, ships out from New York, does some more training in Western France, and eventually he's at the front. Now, he's not an infantryman, he's actually an artilleryman, and he learns how to fire the 75 millimeter guns. He ends up being promoted to be a captain of Battery D. And some of the things we have on display there, you can see his binoculars and stopwatch and revolver and sewing kit. And then on the right, his uniform and hat. And we have multiple uniforms in our museum collection. And so he's there through the end of the war. He actually doesn't come home until May of 1919. But this experience, he's the only president to serve in combat in World War I. This experience changes his life. He's in charge of about 200 men. It gives him the opportunity and the confidence to show his leadership skills. And he comes home a completely changed man. And the soldiers that fought alongside him become his advocates for life. They become his greatest political supporter when he goes into politics in a few years' time. The first thing he does, though, when he gets home is to marry his sweetheart, Bess Wallace. They've been dating since 1910. They finally get married in the summer of 1919 after Harry Truman comes home. These are some of the replica World War I materials he would have used, the caisson on the left and the French 75 millimeter gun on the right. And there's a video that plays behind those, and you can see the shells and the mud replicated on the floor there. And so you see on the left, the wedding photograph. On the far left, in the blue background, you see the wedding photograph there. And in the background, you'll see a baby buggy and a pedal car. And that belonged to their one and only daughter, Mary Margaret Truman, more commonly known as Margaret Truman. They were married in 1919. Margaret was born in 1924. And then on the right side, his first business that he went into after he came back from World War I was with one of his army friends, Eddie Jacobson. They opened up a haberdashery or men's clothing store. And you might see the ties and the shirts and so on there on the right side as well. That store eventually goes bankrupt in the Depression of the 1920s. And after that, he goes into politics. He does that locally, first of all, in Jackson County, which is the county where Independence, Missouri is. And he's connected most strongly with basically the mobster, Tom Pendergast. So that's kind of a stain on his character in many ways. But without the Pendergast support, there's no way he would have been elected. That time in county politics leads to him becoming the United States Senator in the early 1930s. And he has an unfortunate nickname when he arrives in Washington, D.C. And that is, instead of being known as the Senator from Missouri, he's the Senator from Pendergast. So that kind of follows him, and he has to kind of shake that off when he gets to Washington. He serves as senator for 10 years, from 1934 to 1944. When we saw at the beginning, he becomes the vice presidential candidate in the Democratic Convention in the summer of 1944, and ultimately, in January of 1945, becomes the vice president. Some of the interactives we have there, one of the things that Truman did as a senator was to look at wasteful spending in World War II, and he saves the country millions and millions of dollars. And we have a tactile interactive there where you lift up parts of the map to see where he saved money, mostly through wasteful spending by private contractors on government contracts. And he gets national attention for that. He's on the front page of national magazines. He's has a bipartisan committee, and he drives around the country doing this investigation of these mostly factories, investigating the overuse, overspending, and so forth. So he gets national attention that way and kind of shakes off that connection to the Pendergast over that decade. So now we're in April. If you can see the calendar there above the top of the photo, you'll see May, June, July, and August. So imagine you're standing on that day, April 12th, President Roosevelt dies in Georgia. Truman is called from the Senate chambers over to the White House to take the oath of office. And this is what faces him in those first 4 months in office. So in April, on April 12th, as we mentioned a couple of times, he becomes president. In May, Germany surrenders on May 8th, actually his 61st birthday. And we have VE Day, of course, with that German surrender. In June, Truman goes to the first meeting of the United Nations at a conference in San Francisco. In July, he goes to the Potsdam Conference in Germany and meets with Stalin and Churchill. And while he's there at the Potsdam Conference, we have the first successful test of the atomic bomb in New Mexico. And then in August, he has to make the decision to use those 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And you'll see on that photograph in the distance, this cylindrical tube. So we're going to close in on that, just as our visitors do as they go through the museum. And you'll see the 2 artifacts that are displayed in that area of our museum. The one on the left is the safety plug that was inserted in the bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki. And that artifact is in that cylindrical tube. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. And on the right is a paper crane folded by Sadako Sasaki, a Japanese survivor as a child of the Hiroshima bombing. So let me say a little bit more about the safety plug. That was donated to the Truman Library by Philip Barnes, who was the electrical engineer on the plane that was a boxcar as it flew over Nagasaki. He took out the safety plug, this green plug that you see there, inserted the red plug, and then the atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. He put that plug in his pocket and kept it. And then in the 1980s, he donated that to the Truman Library, and it's signed by Philip Barnes and his commanding officer, Frederick Ashworth. And you might just be able to see Frederick Ashworth's signature on the right, bottom right of that tag that's attached to the safety plug. And on the right, the paper crane was folded by Sadako Sasaki. Unfortunately, she did die of radiation sickness because of the Hiroshima bombing. But before she did so, she folded more than 1,000 paper cranes to wish for peace. And this is one of the last cranes that she folded and was donated to us by her brother, who donated it, first of all, to Truman's grandson, who I mentioned earlier, Clifton Truman Daniel. And then Clifton donated it to the library within the last decade. So both of those artifacts, one representing the technology and destruction of the atomic bomb, and the other, the impact on the people living there in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the impact of radiation sickness. Both of those artifacts are in the same gallery, kind of juxtaposed from one another. And so it's a very powerful, emotional gallery. And you see quotes around the wall and videos and so forth. This is the slide you've probably been waiting for. This recognizes the USS Missouri and its role in the surrender after those 2 atomic bombs. When the surrender deck plaque was made for the USS Missouri, there was an exact replica made and presented to President Truman, an exact casting. And so we have this on display on the floor of our museum. It's covered in plexiglass, so people are not walking on it as such, but it's embedded on the floor for people to see, and you can see the USS Missouri, and it's the exact same as what's on the surrender deck. And it's really significant and very well-received artifact that we have on display to signify the importance of the USS Missouri, both to the United States and, of course, to President Truman and his family. And then on the right, the panel that's nearby talks about the surrender and that day on September 2nd. And you see the photographs there of the surrender signing. And then you see some of the other information that goes with that on that part of the display. And so that kind of transitions from the end of the war and the surrender to the next piece of our exhibit, which is to look at the issues that Truman faced after World War II was over. And I'll just pause on that slide a little longer because I'm sure you're excited to see that particular artifact on display in our permanent exhibit. And so the next section of our exhibit is described as the hard problems of peace. So these are the issues that President Truman faced once World War II was over in September of 1945. And these hard problems of peace are all over the globe. And so on this 14-foot high globe that we have featured in our museum exhibit, we have newsreel from the United States, newsreel from Asia, newsreel from Europe, from Russia, from all over the world, from every continent. And you see this silent newsreel just to show you the various issues that face the world now that the World War is over. On the outside of the gallery are exhibits that talk about what Truman tried to do to help with these hard problems of peace. Of course, he couldn't solve everything, but we have, and you can go inside the globe on the back side as well. And there's interactive touch screens inside there as well. So the exhibits talk about the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, the Nuremberg and Tokyo war crimes trials, and others. And so there's a video in that area that talks about the beginnings of the Cold War and the tension between the United States and the Soviet Union that you can see on the map in this video gallery, using the latest projection mapping technology. And that runs through about 7-minute video talking about how we go from the end of World War II to, by 1946 and 1947, we have the beginnings of the Cold War. And you can see just a close-up there of that interactive video gallery. On the other side of the space in 1948, we have an exhibit inside this replica fuselage of B-29, which is showing the Berlin blockade and Berlin airlift, and some of the statistics inside the plane there, and a touchscreen table, which I believe I have another photograph here close up, to talk about the largest humanitarian effort in world history in the summer of 1948, when a coalition of countries shipped supplies via plane, by an airlift, to help protect West Berlin from Stalin and the encroachment by the Soviet Union and East Berlin. And there's another view of that inside the plane with all of the materials, the flour and coal and all of these materials. And they were trying to provide about 2,000 tons of food per day to a population of about 2 million West Berliners for about 15 months. And a hugely successful effort it turned out to be, as eventually Stalin backed down. But we came very, very close to World War III. And there's the touchscreen table that you can learn more about the Berlin airlift with this small interactive device that you drag across the screen and pose questions to learn more about the Berlin blockade and Berlin airlift. Also in 1948, Truman becomes the first world leader to recognize Israel. And we have an 8-minute video and exhibits surrounding it that talk about Truman's role in recognizing Israel. And it's frozen at the right time there. I got lucky with this photograph, actually, because 11 minutes after Israel was declared as a nation, Truman becomes the first world leader to recognize Israel 11 minutes after it's announced its independence, and is recognized in Israel today as being such an important decision that Truman made. It was very controversial, and even members of his own cabinet, like George Marshall, were wholly opposed to this action by Truman. It's really the one issue that his cabinet is split upon, unlike many of the other big decisions he makes during his presidency. And then there's a couple of different angles of this video with the different LED lights that come up at different points. And then you can see different quotes from different people. We're playing with fire on the left, and perhaps these steps would help atone in some way for the atrocities of the Holocaust. Clark Clifford there on the right was Truman's most close advisor on this issue and really was influential in Truman making this decision. And then you see some of the exhibits surrounding that. It's not just a multimedia experience, but we have the full timeline and chronology and documents and artifacts on the other side of the room. And I mentioned these flip books before of contrasting opinions. You might just make out at the bottom of the screen these flip books with different people writing to President Truman for and against what he's doing And so you can see all the shades of opinion in that particular exhibit. Also, in the same year as the Berlin airlift and the recognition of Israel, Truman uses two executive orders to integrate the military and integrate the federal workforce. Civil rights is a huge issue in the United States after the end of World War II, with African American soldiers coming home and going back to segregated cities, and African American soldiers being beaten and lynched on the street. And Truman is enraged by this. He sets up a committee on civil rights. And then by the summer of 1948, he, as I mentioned, declares these two executive orders to integrate the military, integrate the federal workforce, which are incredibly influential today. And of course, that is a presidential election year, 1948. And we have a video there that displays on the back of the train. And then you'll see the famous photograph on the left of Dewey defeats Truman. And we've got a close-up of that I'll show you on the next slide. This is one of our prized possessions in our museum, is this Norman Rockwell painting, Family Squabble, that was on the front cover of the Saturday Evening Post. And you can't quite see the close-up here, but the husband is arguing for Thomas Dewey, and the wife is arguing for Harry Truman. And you see the child under the table weeping. And this kind of just signifies the split in families as we got close to the 1948 election. And it was a very, very close run thing. Of course, the Chicago Tribune thinks that Truman is going to lose, and it publishes this very famous headline the morning after or the night of the election and into the middle of the night. And of course, it turns out to be untrue. Truman actually wins and has that famous photograph of him holding this newspaper. And this is one of the original newspapers that survived. About 100,000 survived. The Chicago Daily Tribune owners actually asked for them to be recalled and burned, but many did survive from that infamous headline. And then they go into the, as he won that election, we go into the Truman's second term. And that is dominated by really two issues: the Red Scare, which you can see indicated there, and China going communist in 1949. And the interactive game that the visitors are playing here is a loyalty oath game. And so they have to answer questions that were used in the HUAC hearings and test their loyalty. And then the other issue that dominates Truman's second term, of course, is the Korean War. And so this is our display on the Korean War from the summer of 1950 through the end of his term. It's still going on, of course, when he leaves office. And the armistice is not until the summer of 1953, after Dwight Eisenhower takes office. We have close-ups there of some of the progression and regression within the war, of the advancing of the troops and back. And then you can see some of the uniforms that we have on display. We have about 75 Korean War uniforms in our collection, and we have 5 Korean War related uniforms on display there, along with some of the artifacts surrounding the Korean War to help tell that story. And that gets us to the end of the Truman period. I just wanted to wrap up. Got about 5 minutes before Q&A, so be ready for that. We do have we have a thematic room that looks at independence. Truman returns to independence after his presidency is over. And we have this beautiful mural that was painted in the early 1960s by the Missouri artist Thomas Hart Benton that is entitled Independence and the Opening of the West. And this is showing the pioneers coming into what was Native American land and becomes the jumping off point for the 3 trails, the Oregon, California, and Santa Fe trails. So this is in our old museum entrance. It's now just part of the exhibits. And we now have this new touchscreen display that visitors can use to explore that painting in more detail and some of the controversial nature around it. But it's still there on display. And it's, as you can see, very vibrant and very popular display. We have a section on Truman's life in Washington, D.C. He lived there for more than 17 years as a senator and vice president and president. And one of the major things that happened while he was president is that the White House was renovated. And these White House beams, these wooden beams, were taken out of the White House during that renovation as they replaced the wooden structure with steel. And so these wooden beams came from the White House. And then there's a whole display there talking about that White House renovation. There you see the touchscreen and the wooden beams hanging above, and then showing the before, during, and after photographs of the White House renovation. And you can see just a close-up of what that screen would look like. You can explore all the floors of the White House through that interactive. And there's another display, and you see some of the artifacts surrounding and even this fireplace was taken out of the White House during the renovation and given to Harry Truman as well. And then some of the other material there, mostly signifying Truman's life in Washington, D.C. during those 17 years. And then the last section is we have a section of the Oval Office, which you can see behind me. I'm not sitting in there today. It's my virtual background. We have a replica of the Truman Oval Office on display for a long time, but we did upgrade that as part of that renovation that I mentioned. And we have a section that looks at the three branches of government, which was incredibly important to President Truman. And we have sections on the legislative branch, the judicial branch, and the executive branch. And there's the executive branch. And the 6 jobs of the president are from a speech that Harry Truman made. And so we show a calendar entry where he practices those 6 jobs all in one day on one occasion. But of course, that would vary day to day. But it's a really incredible civics lesson for students to come through. And we have a very vibrant educational program that uses all of our displays, but in particular these civics education materials. And then we finish off with some political cartoons that were used at the end of Truman's life after he died on December the 26th, 1972. And we see these steps going up as Truman ascends at the steps with atomic development, United Nations founding, Marshall Plan, NATO, Berlin Airlift, Truman Doctrine, and civil rights. So some of those legacy issues that Harry Truman is known for, and you see him there with his trademark cane and HST on his back as he ascends the stairs. And then you can see a photograph here where we show some of the scenes of his life from a farmer, a soldier, a businessman, a politician, a president, and finally a grandfather. He has 4 grandsons. Margaret Truman marries and has 4 sons. And I mentioned one of those earlier, but he does have 4 grandsons in his retirement. And then the final thing is this quote at the end of the lobby of our museum. Mrs. Truman and I hope and believe we have contributed to the welfare of this nation and to the peace of the world. And then there's my contact information. I am the director of the Truman Library, and there's my email address. We are part of the National Archives and the Presidential Library System across the country from Herbert Hoover forward to present day. We have presidential libraries for all those presidents from Herbert Hoover forward. So I will stop my screen share. I'm about right on time. I can't believe it. And we will be ready for the Q&A. Back to you, Jacqueline.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark. That was an awesome presentation. I know we have some questions coming in the chat room, so I'll just get started right away. The first one is the 129th Field Artillery Unit active in the Mo National Guard?
I don't believe so, because it was a field artillery unit. I don't believe that it's still active.
Gotcha.
There is an infantry unit with that name, but not field artillery, I believe. But I can double check on that.
Okay. Another question we have is one of our viewers visited the Little White House in Key West. Are there any
Yes.
stories from there inside of your presidential library?
Yeah, we do actually have a piece on that. It was kind of back in the corner under those White House beams. We have some of the poker chips. He was very much a poker player. And so he was able to relax. And we had a Hawaiian shirt on display there, which was from, even though he was in Florida and not in Hawaii, everyone refers those to Hawaiian shirts. So it's another Hawaiian connection today. But we had a Hawaiian shirt on, and one of his cabinet meetings that he had, they're all sitting around outside in Key West. And he had all of his cabinet members wearing Hawaiian shirts, and people started sending them to him as gifts. So we have numerous Hawaiian shirts on display. But the one we display in our museum is one that was featured on the cover of Life magazine. And so we have that one on display because it was kind of the most notorious of those.
Thank you for sharing that. Another question we had came in was more about the visitation. How many visitors do you receive annually? And to add on that, I had another question as to what part of the renovation and the exhibits that you guys have recently added is the most compelling to your visitors today?
Those are great questions. We average about, I think the visitation has gone up since our renovation. So I believe our average number is between 80 and 90,000 a year now. And then the second part of the question, oh, the most compelling. Well, certainly the atomic bomb and the safety plug that I featured and the paper crane, those are very compelling. I think um, I see a question come up in the chat, and I'm probably going to answer the same question at the same time about my favorite artifact, but it's also a very compelling artifact. So I'm going to use the same answer for two questions. And that is we have a Purple Heart from the Korean War that's on display. And that's very compelling because it was sent to President Truman by a gentleman who lost his son in the Korean War. And he sent a scathing letter to Harry Truman, criticizing him for putting troops on the ground and blaming him for his son's death. And in this scathing letter, he wishes for the same treatment for Harry Truman's daughter, Margaret. Now, you might think that Harry Truman would throw that away or, respond angrily or whatever. He actually kept the Purple Heart and the letter in his desk, even in retirement. So when he died in 1972 and we cleared out his desk or did an inventory of his desk at the Truman Library, he worked at the Truman Library for 15 years. When we cleared out that desk and took stock of everything, we found that Purple Heart and letter. So we kept it with him. So it was very, very meaningful to him. And it really is compelling to me. And it's one of my favorite artifacts because it really tells the story of presidential responsibility and how those decisions would weigh on him for the rest of his life. So maybe that was one answer to two questions.
No, that's great. Thank you. We have another guest that wants an explanation of the background and the Benton painting and how it got there. Where was
Yeah,
it exhibited and how did you guys obtain it?
it's a really good question. And so when the building was opened in 1957, the wall where that mural is painted was Burr, and that was the main entrance to the museum. So there was very much a discussion about some type of mural or some type of painting there. As because President Truman is from Missouri, the museum is in Missouri. The most notable Missouri artist at that time was Thomas Hart Benton, and so they contracted with him. At first, Harry Truman and Thomas Hart Benton didn't get along very well at the beginning, but as they got to know each other more, shared a few drinks in Harry Truman's office, quite frankly, they got to know each other more and they started to plan the mural. At first, Truman had very grandiose ideas of representing Jeffersonian democracy. I'm not sure how you do that in a painting, and Thomas Hart Benton didn't know how to do that either, really. So they kept continuing their conversation, and ultimately they came down to wanting to portray really the beginnings of the town of Independence, the city of Independence, and how it was settled and how important it was for the three trails. The Truman connection there is that Harry Truman's grandfather, Solomon Young, was a trader on the Santa Fe Trail. So he was still alive when Truman was born. So we heard all these exciting stories about the Santa Fe Trail from his grandfather. And so that was very, very much in Truman's background. And so as they had that conversation, then Thomas Hart Benton painted that mural directly on the wall. He did about 3 years of research, traveled on the trails to sketch the native flora and fauna, and had models that he made, three-dimensional models made out of clay, before he painted the mural directly on the wall in the museum. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yes, that was great. Thank you. I had another question that's more relative to the renovation that you guys did. I know you talked a little bit about the work that went in behind it, who all was involved, the resources necessary. One of those obviously is funding. For a $29 million project, where did that funding come from?
A really good question. We are a federal building and we're part of the federal agency, the National Archives, which runs the presidential libraries. But the federal money does not provide any money for exhibits, doesn't provide any money for education and public programming. It just provides for the staff. So for that $29 million project, we have a partner, Truman Library Institute, who's our nonprofit partner that raised the $29 million over about 5 years to fund that project. So we're a really classic private-public partnership. So without the support of our non-for-profit organization, that exhibit renovation certainly would not have happened. So the federal money doesn't pay for anything like that. So yeah, it was all privately fundraised over the course of about 5 years. Really good question.
There was another question. The picture on the screen shows Leahy on the left. Do you know who the captain on the right is?
It's not very clear on my screen. It may be part of the buffering from Jacqueline, so maybe they could send
Sorry,
it.
we can resend it. Just one last question from my end. You covered a lot in the presentation about world conflict that occurred during Truman's presidential time in office and many things that he had to deal with as the president of the United States. What would you say was the hardest decision that he ever had to make during his time as president?
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, most people would think, I would say, the decision to drop the atomic bomb. In his own writings, he denies that. He thought that was a pretty straightforward decision, quite honestly. I think what he has written and what he spoke about in interviews and so forth, and written in his memoirs, he said the most difficult decision was to put troops into the Korean War. I think it becomes because he was a soldier himself who'd been on the ground. He'd seen death and destruction in World War One, and that really stood with him as a captain in Battery D in World War One. So when it came to the Korean War, he knew the sacrifices that people were going to make by putting boots on the ground, as they say, to put men in harm's way. And so he always said to put troops on the ground in the Korean War was his most difficult decision. And you can kind of understand why when you think of it that way.
Hmm.
It's very interesting. No, thank you for sharing.
If I may,
Thank you, Mark Adams, for your. Oh, go
if
ahead,
I
Mark.
may, Mark, I don't know if you are aware of this, but when you started your renovation, you had a 16-piece set of the Missouri Silver, which was ostensibly returned to the state of Missouri archives, but we managed to waylay it, and that set of that once a place setting of silver is now here in our wardroom, and so if you were wondering what happened to it, it made it directly back to us, and I'd like to we're going to keep it because it helps us tell the story of the ship Silver, and with Governor Kehoe is a great friend now of the Missouri, and he's been a tremendous supporter of a lot of our renovation projects, and so I'll be there in a couple of weeks to meet with him, but. We appreciate having your silver and hope it stays here for a while.
That's wonderful to tie the knot on that story. I was not aware of that. That's really fascinating. I know I mentioned to Jacqueline, I visited the USS Missouri in January of 2007, and my greatest experience there was going through the chow line, seeing the photographs of Harry Truman eating there and just visiting with the soldiers. So that close connection there certainly is maintained, and
Well,
sounds
that
like you
was
were
because the ship
people.
took he and Margaret and Bess to a conference in Rio in
Right,
1947, waited for him, and then brought him all the way back. So he actually spent several weeks, like 6 weeks, on the ship at that time.
right. Yeah, there's some wonderful photographs from that era.
Thank you again, Mark. Go
Thank
ahead,
you, Mike.
Jacqueline.
Thank you for your added comment there. That's really great to hear.
Thank you, Mike. And thank you again, Mark Adams, for the wonderful presentation, for joining us today, and for your time and efforts in sharing the great renovation and the wonderful exhibits that are displayed in the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library. We appreciate your time spending with us today. We would invite all of you to stay connected with us on Instagram, TikTok, or Facebook. These are quarterly events that we hold. This is our first of the year. So thank you again for kicking us off on such an exceptional note, Mark. Again, thank you for all for attending and spending some of your day with us. And we appreciate your time again, Mark.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you, Mark. Hope to see you soon.
Thank you.